when you walk through a storm.
As cataract anterior segment surgeons, we are often faced with challenging and complex scenarios, and none more so than a subluxated or dislocated intraocular lens. In this video, I'd like to highlight two particular techniques, which is the Yamane technique, as well as the modification using the 6.0 Prolene. So what are the 12 steps for Yamane success? And number one is to use AC maintainer. That has to maintain good pressure within the eye as we manipulate within it. So I like to put the AC maintainer around about 7 to 8 o'clock, and my paracentesis at 10 and 2 o'clock, and this can be good ergonomics to actually control the eye. Always do a good anterior vitrectomy, and that's tip number 3. I like the pars plana approach, and try still always to highlight the vitreous to ensure you get good, adequate and complete vitreous clearance. Number 4 refers to marking the entry points. I use an image-guided system, but really any of the available markers would suffice. It's important to get a good 180-degree points, and I go 2.5mm posterior to the limbus. Using a 3-piece intraocular lens with PVDF haptics is important because they are more resilient to damage, and basically you have to check whether these haptics fit into the thin-walled 30-gauge needles before you enter the eye. The needles I like to mark 3mm posterior to the tip with a little ink mark. This denotes how long my scleral tunnel is. I like to bend the needle 70 degrees, about 2mm from the hub. The angle of entry is important as well. So if you have a straight line parallel to the limbus, you want to put the needle entering about 20 degrees to that line. You want to be almost quite flat, 5 degrees to the scleral surface. The leading haptic is easier to manipulate compared to the trailing haptic, but you want to grab with a 23-gauge intraocular forceps, in this case the haptic near the tip, and internalize about half the actual haptic and leave the needle in the eye. The trailing haptic, you use the needle pass the same way you would do in the opposite direction, but really once you get it into the actual eye, you want to externalize that first and grab hold to the haptic so that it doesn't slip back into the eye. Now using the low heat cautery, you don't need to touch the haptic, you just bring that very close, and with the PVDF haptics you get a nice little bulb, and you don't need a big one because it's 30 gauge. And as you adjust the haptics, do it slowly, keeping your eye on the centration of the intraocular lens, whether there's any tilt, because there's an opportunity before you bury that flange. If you need to adjust, you can actually do that now. And finally, always do a peripheral iridectomy. That's easily done with the anterior retractor, as we have that on hand already. So what are the tools that require? I think the thin-walled 30-gauge needle, the TSK thin-walled needle, is going to be good enough. Intraocular forceps, I use an MST forceps. You could use any other intraocular forceps. Low heat cautery, in this case, is a disposable one. And markers, this could be a toric marker or a Mendes marker if you don't have an image guided. And of course, our PVDF haptic 3-piece intraocular lens. Some of the points to remember: the entry points have to be equidistant from the limbus and 180 degrees apart. If not, you need to adjust it either by repassing the actual needle or to actually cut off the end and recreating a flange. The Yamane technique limits you to the use of a 3-piece intraocular lens. So the flange 6.0 Prolene would actually be able to manage 1-piece intraocular lenses. In this first case, I termed the loose bag, where there's a patient with pseudoexfoliation and subluxated intraocular lens and capsular bag. So after marking with an image-guided system about 2.5mm posterior to the limbus, as well as 1.5mm posterior to the limbus along the same meridian, I will use a 27-gauge needle to go in under the haptic and through the capsular bag, and subsequently bringing in a 6.0 Prolene from the opposite direction into the 27-gauge needle to externalize that end. Subsequently re-entering the eye with the 27-gauge needle again at the 1.5mm mark, bringing in the other end of the 6.0 Prolene and thereby creating a lasso to capture that haptic. I will repeat the same procedure again on the opposite side in order to lasso the opposite haptic. As you can see in this video, it creates a very nice fixation of the intraocular lens and capsular bag. And what you do is, with the principles of Yamane, use your low heat cautery to create those flanges with the 6.0 Prolene and subsequently bury it back into the sclera. Yet another scenario that could arise would be a dislocated 1-piece intraocular lens. So in this case, I rescued the lens into the anterior chamber, externalized one haptic, And the 6O Prolene comes with a needle, so I would pass that needle near the haptic-optic junction and create a flange at that end to fixate that haptic. So this Prolene suture is down externalized with a 27 gauge needle at a pre-marked 2.5mm posterior to the limbus, in this case at 3 o'clock. And I would then externalize the other haptic and pass a needle to fixate this haptic with a 6O Prolene flange first, and then passing through to another 27 gauge needle at the 9 o'clock position to fixate this lens as shown here. Yet another scenario would be a dislocated intraocular lens, CTR and capsular bag. So using the same principles after doing a posterior vitrectomy and bringing the whole complex into the front of the eye in the anterior chamber, I would pass the 27 gauge needle underneath the haptic and CTR through the capsular bag, bring in the 6O Prolene from the opposite direction to actually create a lasso as illustrated in the first case. As you can see here, it's important to remember the second pass you have to go above the actual capsular bag, and as opposed to the first pass which goes through it and under the haptic. In this way you get a lasso on either end. This final scenario is a Marfan's patient who actually had scleral fixated intraocular lenses done 15 years ago. So this dislocated, and rather than externalizing or explanting this whole lens through a large incision, I've decided to bring out one of the haptics where the eyelids are, using a 6O Prolene to pass through the eyelid and create a flange to fixate the haptic first, and bringing this end of the haptic into the eye and bringing the Prolene out to hold it at the 3 o'clock position, and then subsequently externalizing the other haptic, passing the Prolene suture through the eyelid and fixating it there with the flange, and bringing that end of the Prolene out at 9 o'clock and subsequently fixating that to the sclera with 2 further flanges as shown here. So some of the tools required, I think in addition to what you already have for the Yamane technique, is just a 27 gauge needle and the 6O Prolene, which is readily available. But some points to remember: the length of suture that you want to create to heat to get a nice bulb is around about 2 to 3 millimeters. And you want to be able to hold the suture taut to the intraocular lens and as well as flush to the sclera as possible as you create these flanges so there's no sag. So this video has highlighted the use of the Yamane as well as modification using a 6O Prolene to create flanges to manage either 3-piece intraocular lenses or using the technique to manage 1-piece intraocular lenses as well. So I hope this will provide you a good starter guide and bring you along on your journey to using these very useful techniques. And just remember, you'll never have to walk alone. Thank you.